Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. Tim and I, PRI's Senior Director of Communications, and I chatted with Lance Izumi, Senior Director of PRI's Center for Education. He joins us to discuss a situation caused by the coronavirus pandemic that millions of parents never thought they'd find themselves in, homeschooling their kids. He shares the advice from experts on homeschooling, offers online education and homeschooling resources, discusses state and federal efforts to make it easier for parents and students to access online education, and spotlights how teacher unions and opponents of charter schools are not allowing the crisis to go to waste to further their policy agenda. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Next Round, Lance.
Thanks a lot, Ro. Great to be on here with you and Tim.
So, Lance, you've been working on the online learning issue, distance learning, for many years now, and it's now at the forefront because of the coronavirus. The Trump administration has made it easier for more students to access online education, especially students with disabilities. Tell us about what they've done and how it will benefit students, and also what is California doing at the state level?
Well, thanks a lot, Ro. So many districts around the country were interpreting federal laws to say that unless every child had the same online opportunities, then no child could actually have any of those opportunities. So basically making the perfect the enemy of the good. And so thankfully the Trump administration has said that that was actually absolutely wrong. And so Education Secretary Betsy DeVos has said that during this crisis, it's actually an opportunity to pursue a much more flexible way of creating environments for students to learn. And so therefore the U.S. Department of Education has actually issued a guidance to school districts that says that feds do not want to stand in the way of any good faith efforts to educate students online. And specifically, the Department of Education says that federal laws such as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is also referred to by its acronym IDEA. So IDEA and other federal laws should not prevent any schools from offering educational programs through distance learning. And I should point out that there are a lot of ways for students with learning disabilities to be educated online and at home. Online education companies like K-12 Incorporated literally educate millions of children with learning disabilities. In my newest book for PRI that I co-authored with Mia Giordano, which is entitled Mia's Journey, and which will be coming out sometime in the next few months, it actually tells a story of how Mia went from being a student with severe learning disabilities to someone who will now be going to probably a prestigious university. And she was able to accomplish this transformation through homeschooling and using a computer-based program called Aerosmith. So with regards to California, though, the California Department of Education has put out actually a really good informative guide to distance learning during this crisis. And I should also point out that distance learning, for our listeners who are not familiar with the term, distance learning is when an instructor and the student are actually in two different remote locations. And so, but distance learning could take many different forms. It could include like audio instruction, online learning, instructional television, and could also include things like even giving out printed assignments and materials that are actually delivered to students. So it gives this memo that the Department of Education here in California gave out, gives advice to the local school districts about ways to maximize the positive impact of distance learning. And one of the examples that it gives is the partnership between a number of school districts here in California and the local public broadcasting stations in their area, where the television stations actually broadcast instructional classes in core subjects throughout the days, with different grades being instructed at different times of the day. So there is a lot of different types of distance learning, online learning that is actually being now put out there for schools and for parents to choose from.
Lance, as you know, there are many innovative schools in California that have made online learning a core part of their learning philosophy even before the coronavirus. You've written about 2 California schools that have beefed up their existing online learning platforms, as now all students are learning remotely from home with shelter-in-place orders, and it's pretty unlikely that they're going to go back to school this year. So talk about what these schools are doing and how it will ensure that students stay on track even as, campuses will be closed probably until the fall.
Oh, thanks, Tim. Well, the two schools to which you refer to are charter schools that I cited in my recent article on the coronavirus and online learning, which was just recently published in the Washington Examiner. But both of these schools are actually also schools that I profiled in my book, Choosing Diversity, How Charter Schools Promote Diverse Learning Models and Meet the Diverse Needs of Parents and Children. And the first school is Summit Shasta Charter School, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it's part of a network of charter schools in California and Washington State. And all the students at this school and all the other Summit schools have access to the Summit Learning Platform, which is an online platform containing playlists of various resources. And so here's how that works. Summit teachers curate these resources and organize them into online playlists that introduce each topic, subject area, and it links to videos, slideshows, websites, readings, and practice worksheets. So students engage with these resources and choose the best ones to help them learn both at school and at home. And so the learning platform actually allows students to set their goals, track their progress, and direct their own learning by accessing the resources that make up the Summit curriculum. So it's very much student-centered. And because the Summit learning model is based on this online learning platform, the school has announced that it's actually starting its entire learning model going to a virtual system during this coronavirus crisis. So it was really tailor-made. Unfortunately, we would, of course, not want to have a crisis to engender this, but given the crisis, Summit has been able to transition seamlessly into a virtual learning system. And the second school that I mentioned in the articles and also in my book is Design Tech, which is a charter high school in the San Francisco Bay Area. And that school uses new learning technologies that allow students to interact with content, get instant feedback on their work, and be tutored by computer programs. So switching to a total distance learning system was relatively easy for the parents and the children at that school as well. I actually asked a friend of mine, Christine Zanello, who's a parent of two students at Design Tech, how her daughters were doing, and she said they were actually doing homeschool that is not much different because Design Tech is really designed for online learning. So it really was a seamless transition for them as well as all the rest of the students at Design Tech. So those are just two examples of schools that have an online basis and that were able to then transition into basically schooling their kids virtually from home.
Lance, we hear a lot about efforts to bridge the quote-unquote digital divide in California because, not every family can afford a computer or even Wi-Fi. What can be done to help these students so that they don't lose out on a good education as we shelter from at home these days just because they don't have a family computer?
Well, that's a really important point, Ro. So, let me just first point out that, in my previous answer and where I described the Summit charter schools, Summit actually issues every student a Chromebook. So they already have the hardware, and of course they'll have the software to go along with it. In terms of the regular public schools, there are school districts here in California, for example, that are certainly trying to bridge that divide. The Madera School District, which is in the Fresno area, has instituted a program that would get every student in their district a Chromebook and internet access through Comcast's low-cost Internet Essentials program, which is now offering 2 months of free service to low-income families. But not all school districts are doing this. And so, what I think really, rather than rely on kind of the hit-and-miss efforts of school districts to provide either the hardware or that internet access, that the best thing really is for California to do something like pass an emergency education savings account law that would send funding to parents so that they could pay for homeschooling tools such as tutoring or online learning products. This would give all parents the means to access online tools and would also give them the ability to choose the services, programs, and curriculum that really best meets the needs of their children. Because even when school districts, offer, things to parents, oftentimes, you're still basically trying to replicate public school at home.
Lance, many school districts were caught off guard and in some cases unprepared for the coronavirus. How do you rate the ability of school districts and their current technology platforms statewide to quickly shift to an online learning format? Do you think it will impact the ability of students to pass their current courses or even graduate? And, going forward into the next school year, do you anticipate that there'll be a spike in remedial courses in the fall to account for potentially lost subject matter this spring?
Well, I think that many school districts are really unprepared to transition into online learning. And this is not only because they lack the necessary hardware and software, but really the biggest problem, one of the biggest problems anyway that I see, is that the teachers are really almost wholly untrained in online teaching. And so one of the other books that I've written for Pacific Research Institute called Moonshots in Education, which PRI released a few years ago, I co-authored the section of the book that looked at the training of teachers in online education. And what I found was, not just in California, but throughout the United States, that most teachers in this country really get no sort of online teaching education in their credentialing programs. And, that's a huge difference than if you look across the world to countries like South Korea or China or places like Singapore, for example. Like in Singapore, all teachers are trained in online learning, and they not only have that skill, but the country actually will conduct an entire e-learning week where all of the teaching that goes on is done online, because not only do they have the capability, but all the teachers have that training in order to do that. In my book, Moonshots, I interviewed a teacher, Caitlin Tucker, who is a teacher in Sonoma County here in Northern California, and she has written a book on online teaching for teachers. But one of the things she told me was that at her own school, it was probably lucky if 10% of the teachers at her school would be able to teach using these online tools. And so, that is, I think, is going to be one of the big stumbling blocks for the public schools anyway, to really address this crisis, using, one of their most expensive resources, their teachers. So, I think that it's unclear, if there's going to be a need for a lot of remedial, and a lot of it's going to depend on the parents and how they access homeschool learning resources that are widely available, and how they make use of that as to whether we're going to see a big spike in the need for remedial or not.
Lance, that's actually what I'm hearing on the ground from my friends who are teachers, that it's actually the students who can pick up online learning easily, but it's the teachers who can't make it happen for them. And there are only a handful of teachers in the whole school who can do Zoom and some of these other, new technologies that can help them teach their classrooms. But it's terrible because these few teachers who can actually do this have to teach 90% of the other teachers. So it's virtually impossible. But on the other hand, the kids pick it up fairly quickly because they grew up on, these technologies their whole lives. But anyway, that leads me to, the role of unions. So there's been a roadblock on online learning put up by the teachers' unions because in some of the school districts, some unions are demanding that districts collectively bargain online learning before they will even give the green light. Are these unions really going to prevent students from learning when students are stuck at home for weeks and weeks? And what can local districts do to ensure their students are educated if unions are blocking online learning?
Well, the short answer to your question, Ro, is yes, and the unions will definitely try. The teachers' unions are all about power and control. They're not about education. They're not about, focusing on the learning of students. It's about power and control. And they can see that once parents realize that it is possible to educate their own kids at home without the massive government school system, then a lot of them may decide that they don't need to send their children back to poorly performing schools that indoctrinate their kids and that are often unsafe. And so that's why I think, you see, for example, the National Education Association, which is the country's largest union, just a few years ago passed a resolution that claims that homeschooling programs based on parental choice cannot provide students with a comprehensive education experience, and therefore instruction should only be done by government-licensed teachers teaching a government-approved curriculum. So basically, in order to combat the power and the ideological agenda of the unions, school districts really have to grow a spine and not be pushed around by the unions. But unfortunately, many school boards are actually controlled by the unions because the unions are the ones who, of course, have the most money to spend in school board elections. So it's unlikely that a lot of these districts will end up standing up to the unions. And that's why I go back to what I had mentioned earlier, is that we need to empower parents through things such as education savings account. And while it'd be difficult to enact ESAs here in California because of the anti-school choice majority in Sacramento. Congress can actually send more federal dollars down straight to parents as education savings accounts, at least for some categories of children. So unions are going to continue to be unions. They're going to continue to drive their own self-interested agenda. So therefore, what we need to do is that, go around not just the unions, but also, the school boards that they control and the whole government apparatus, and you give that power over the direction of education and learning to parents.
Lance, Rahm Emanuel has famously said that you should never allow a good crisis to go to waste as far as pushing your policy agenda. And we've seen recently here that the Los Angeles Teachers Union is doing just that. They're actually using the coronavirus as an excuse to push their anti-charter schools agenda. So just what exactly are they proposing, and do you foresee a push by the legislature to further target charter schools in the name of responding to the coronavirus?
Tim, the United Teachers of Los Angeles, the LA Teachers Union, is trying to use the coronavirus crisis to force the LA School Board to not approve any new charter schools during this period of this emergence. So districts really need to resist this union power play. I mean, as I mentioned before, the California Department of Education says that distance learning is critical at this time for our children, and that the department even uses in its informational memo Westlake Charter School, which is in the Sacramento area, as a distance learning model that regular public schools should copy. So what if a proposed charter school copies the Westlake Charter School model, which has been endorsed by the State Department of Education? What reason would there be to deny its petition to open up? Well, of course, the reason has nothing to do with providing good education for students. The unions actually want to delay charter school approvals until July, when the new law signed by Governor Newsom that will stop charter school expansion will then go into effect. So it's all a blatant, selfish power play by the teachers union. But, after seeing them in action for so many years, all I have to say about that is really what else is new. So I'm sure that going forward, the unions will continue to push their allies in the legislature and their union-endorsed governor to enact more anti-charter laws. But, I think that, you have to look at how some of these anti-charter school laws that have been passed recently, have really now hurting children. For example, there's been a 2-year moratorium on virtual charter schools here in California. And so, given the coronavirus crisis and the need for online schools, how's that working out for California?
So, Lance, millions of California parents became homeschoolers once these shelter-in-place orders were made. So many parents have no idea where to start. You wrote a column featuring the advice of experts for new homeschooling parents. Give us some of the highlights.
Well, thanks, Ra. I talked to Sarah Bailey, who's the founder of Love of Learning Homeschool Learning Center, which is located in the Sacramento, California area, and which provides supplemental classes for homeschooling families that support and enrich what is taught at home. And when I talked to her, I asked her if she had talked with parents who, are now being forced into this situation of having to, for the first time, consider homeschooling their kids. And she said, actually, she's talked to a lot of those types of parents who are dealing with these school closures. And her first advice to them has been not to panic. She told me that many parents have never had their children home all day, so she tells them it's a great time to slow down and get to know your child. She advises them to read books together, go on walks and bike rides, play games, and actually eat meals together. When parents make the decision, however, to homeschool their children, she tells them that there is really so much for them to choose from out there. She tells parents that what they ought to do to start with is to begin with the end in mind. And she says that parents should ask, what kind of adults do you want your child to be, and then go from there. And what's nice about homeschooling, she says, is that if a certain curriculum isn't working out for that child, you can actually switch it at any time. And I think that a lot of parents right now are worried about, oh gosh, we have never homeschooled before. What if we make mistakes, or if we choose something that's wrong? And she says to them, you don't really have to do it all yourself, and you don't have to be a teacher, in which case she means actually a government licensed teacher, to teach your kids really well. And the things that she cautions against, and I mentioned this earlier, is that parents should not simply try to replicate public school at home. They should really look at their individual needs of their child, which often isn't being met at their local public school, and then address those needs, not try and simply replicate what was going on in that kid's classroom. So, but in terms of the how-to part of it, how do you actually go about, homeschooling your child? Sarah told me that, there's lots of different resources out there that will actually teach parents how, best practices in terms of actually homeschooling their child. In fact, I just read yesterday that the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, which is the largest homeschooling association in the country, has a great how-to homeschooling guide on their website. But Sarah says really the bottom line is that for many homeschoolers, worries about how the kids are going to do really are not what parents should be worrying about, because by naturally homeschooling your child, what you end up and addressing their individual needs, you'll end up with kids who are performing, who are doing well, and who actually be more socially secure than their peers who are who go back to the public school system. And her bottom line is you won't close any doors to your child's future by homeschooling. In fact, what you'll do is you'll actually free them to become who they really want to be.
One lesser-known aspect about homeschooling is that there actually are quite a bit of online resources available to help parents and students. You've written about some of them. What are some of these online resources, and how are they helping parents educate their kids during these difficult times?
Well, thanks, Tim. Yeah, one of the largest free resources out there is the Khan Academy, which is a comprehensive program of YouTube videos on subjects like math, English, science, and history. Parents can view the content and track their children's progress. I actually wrote a report on Khan Academy for PRI a few years ago, and PRI actually awarded one of its top honors to Sal Khan, the founder of the Khan Academy. I've also written about the core knowledge curriculum, which was developed by the great University of Virginia education professor E.D. Hirsch. Now, core knowledge, a lot of people have heard of it. It's a comprehensive, content-rich curriculum on subjects that range from, let's say, English to history to geography. And what's great about the core knowledge curriculum, especially in this situation, this crisis, that it's available free online through the Core Knowledge Foundation website. So, if parents are interested in checking that out and seeing if that's right for their child, they can look at the entire curriculum online. One new program that I think has a lot of promise is the Dexter Online School, which is an online program meant to help students continue learning during the school closures. The program is being offered free to students until the beginning of May, and students who use the Dexter program can access online curriculum, live-streamed interactive lectures by teachers, social forums, and peer-to-peer messaging, and parents will have access to parent portals to keep track of their students' progress and receive weekly progress reports via email. I actually registered for the Dexter program and watched several of the interactive lectures and looked over the curricula, and I was really impressed. For example, in an online class on computer coding, the teacher played a logic game on the screen with one of the attending online students, and that student beat the professor or the teacher. In an English grammar class that I watched, the teacher interacted through the whole lesson with the students who were sending in comments and questions in real time. So I interviewed Michael Olaya, who's the head of Dexter, and he said that homeschool families are demanding more rigorous curricula, better online tools, and safe community learning spaces. And what he sees happening is that competitive pressure, and because, as I mentioned, there are a lot of homeschool and online programs that are out there for parents, that the competitive pressure has led to the creation of categorically new types of schooling that are driving quality up and costs down, all great things for parents.
Lance, now that millions of parents will have been temporary homeschoolers, do you think that there will be an attitude shift for homeschooling as a school choice option? And has the coronavirus shattered a lot of myths? And do you think long-term families and parents might actually make more demands for online learning and even shift to homeschooling?
I really do, Ro. Before this crisis, there were 2 million homeschoolers in the United States. I expect that number to spike after this crisis is over, because a lot of parents are going to find out that they really can homeschool their children effectively. And parents are going to find out that there are many more resources, as I mentioned before, than they had expected, to help them homeschool their kids. And again, this is not only curriculum, but it's also resources about actually how to homeschool their children. So, really, what I think, I should cite cite my good friend Larry Sand, who's a retired Los Angeles teacher and a really great education reformer. And he wrote recently that once families homeschool their kids, they may find that their children are more literate while at the same time not exposed to graphic sex education, bullies, political indoctrination, and teacher union selfishness. And those actually are all the things that I wrote about in one of my other PRI books, The Corrupt Classroom, which our institute published a couple of years ago. So I think that what you're going to see is that a lot of parents, I'm not saying all parents, but a lot of parents are going to have positive experiences with homeschooling. They're going to find out they're able to do a lot more than they had expected, that it was much more doable, that their children are going to enjoy the experience. They are going to be calmer, be able to advance and progress at their own pace, not be anchored to some low common denominator, and that the control that parents are going to have over their children's education is going to end up causing them to rethink what education is really like in America, not only what education should be like for their kids. So I think parents are going to end up liking it a lot, and you're probably going to see a permanent increase in the number of homeschoolers here in the United States, and probably worldwide too, because of coronavirus is affecting children across the world.
For a final question, Lance, we're seeing parents having to make a big adjustment to educating their kids now that we have these shelter-in-place orders and they're at home for the foreseeable future. Given that, are there any policy changes that you recommend the legislature consider to ensure that every student can learn digitally for a potentially extended stay at home while they're sheltering in place? And how about for homeschooling as well?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One of the laws that I actually cited and said needed to be reformed several years ago, I actually written another book on online learning for PRI called Short Circuited, and it was about how California needed to reform its laws in order to make online learning more accessible for students in the state. And one of those laws that I said needed to be reformed was something called the Contiguous Counties rule. And what that law does is that it prevents students from accessing a virtual charter school that is based in a county that is not contiguous to where that student resides. So if you were in Los Angeles County, you could not access the online program of a virtual charter school that was based, let's say, in Sacramento County. And that, if you just think about that for even a nanosecond, it doesn't make any sense, right? Because the internet stopped at the county line, that you could not learn if actual physical location of that virtual school was, X number of counties away from you, which is just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I mentioned, for example, the Dexter Online program. They're based in Wichita Falls, Texas, and yet they're having students from all across the world who are accessing their program and learning. And so, why California should have, something as archaic and obsolete, and certainly in thinking, as the Contiguous Counties rule is just mind-boggling. But again, it's an anti-charter law that fits into the agenda of a lot of the public education monopolists who populate Sacramento. The other thing that California should really consider, and despite the political challenges to enacting it, but it's something that I've mentioned several times in this interview, is that we need to really look at something like education savings accounts, because in order to get around these laws, get around the interest groups, get around all of the different union collective bargaining agreements that hamstring education, conventional education here in California, if you give the money to the parents in order to decide which type of learning tools, which type of education model is best for their child, it's going to end up pleasing not only the parents, but also improve the performance of the kids and, really make education funding much more efficient than, what we're doing right now, where so much of the dollars that we're spending, taxpayer dollars that we're spending in education in California is really wasted and, going into areas that have nothing to do with improving the learning of children. If you send, that money straight to the parents and the kids and bypass all of this bureaucracy and special interest, that, you're going to end up getting better bang for your buck. And so, I think that those are the two places that California should really take a look. And, I should also lastly mention that education savings accounts, have been enacted in other states. So there are working models that California can look at to see, what is working, across the United States. And, it's something that parents, I think, should really clamor for. And I think they will, especially because now they will see that, hey, we can homeschool our kids. It'd be better if some of the money that, is going into education goes straight to us.
Thanks so much, Lance.
Thank you, Ro. Thank you, Tim. Always great to talk with you on this podcast.
Special thanks to our friend and colleague, Lance Izumi. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.